Repellency, Pesky Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen VanTassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here. Hi everyone, Stephen VanTassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pesky Podcast family. Hey, glad to have you on board. I'm putting together a pretty quick podcast here. I'm going to be heading out for a conference on wildlife across America, I believe. So I'm going to be traveling out. So this will be kind of brief. I figured since it's the summertime, many of you, particularly those of you out on the East Coast, are probably dealing with some woodchuck calls, and so came across this particular article that I thought I would share along with you. Let me pause for a moment. Do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the channel, ring the bell. Definitely would like you to put in a comment in the area. Also, if you can give us a 5-star recommendation, that would be much appreciated. But of course, you can always reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. So you can also comments, criticisms, thoughts. I did get some a criticism from a fine guy who was commenting on one of my earlier podcasts, and he made some important points, and I will respond to some of those. And I think for the most part, I agreed with his comments. And I appreciated his follow-up. So yeah, I was probably a little soft on one of the products I mentioned. So I will probably do a podcast on that coming up soon. But today, I'm just doing something really quick on woodchucks. This is an article I came across, and let me read the authors and the title of it. Unfortunately, I don't have the publication that it came out. It looked like it came out in like a proceedings or a book-like form, but nevertheless, you can probably search for it on your own if you want to. I'm going to be summarizing it here for you, but I want to be sure I give them credit. It's from, the authors are that's the letter N, J. Bean, and Wyatt L. Korf, and J. Russell Mason. And the article is entitled Repellency of Plant, Natural Products, and Predator Odors to Woodchucks. And the page numbers are page 13, or maybe this is chapter 13. Let me take a quick look. So it'd be chapter or article 13, pages 139 all the way down to... of course, the last page doesn't have a number here, of course. That would be too easy. 1 to 146. So 139 to 146. So it looks like it was part of a publication called the National Wildlife Research Center Repellents Conference in 1995. So that should help you there. So National Wildlife Research Center Repellents Conference 1995. Now, as you all know, if you've been in the wildlife control field for any length of time, there is this incessant search, and I know I'm being a little negative here, but just bear with me. There's this incessant search for the repellent that's supposed to drive wildlife away. And my analogy is sort of like the search for a safe cigarette, right? I mean, the University of Kentucky, it's my understanding, spent 20 years trying to develop a safe cigarette, and they finally gave up. I think at some point, we need to give up to a certain degree. But nevertheless, because the problem is that repellents have a lot of things against them. Number one, our clients typically want not a reduction of damage, they want the elimination of damage. And so that's a very tall order. Number two, when these studies are done and they find efficacy, again, the efficacy tends to be marginal. In other words, if I'm using sterile water in one bowl and I'm using XYZ repellent in another bowl, chances are the animal is going to be quote unquote repelled from the repellent rather than the sterile water, because there's going to be no odor to the water, right? I mean, it's just if you have a choice, am I going to go near something that smells bad versus something that doesn't smell bad? yeah, you're going to go for that, right? But in terms of repellency, but if you're starving, are you going to just simply grin and bear it? Yeah, so it's a tough call. So, we certainly want researchers to continue work, but we tend to have this notion that we're going to somehow find this magic product. I just don't see. Maybe with AI, and a show I saw the other night talked about how AI is being used, that's artificial intelligence, is being used to develop new chemicals and medications in the medical field. Some that can be like targeted to people with very unique illnesses, which is hard for companies to make money on because there's so few people that have them. So this can be revolutionary. Maybe AI will bring us closer to this repellent that's going to do what we would like it to do. All right, but nevertheless, your clients are going to be asking about repellents. It's important for us as wildlife control professionals to know about repellents, to be able to answer some of these questions based on not just our gut opinion, but on field research. And the people here are from a very prestigious school. Vassar College is where they did the work. Vassar College is if it's not Ivy League, it's pretty close. I had a friend of mine from Vassar College, and God, he was absolutely brilliant. Scary brilliant in terms of what he could process. And so people go to Vassar College. That is a very serious school, and that's where the research was done and the work that they did. So they were studying on woodchucks. For those of you may call them groundhogs or whistle pigs. And so it's Marmota monax. So it's not the western woodchuck, what we call the rock chuck out here. It's not the western version, it's the eastern version. But my suspicion is this would likely be applicable to the western species as well. But nevertheless, the research was done on Marmota monax. That's your woodchuck out in the east. So what did they do? They basically took various chemicals and they created a box that was rectangular in length, and they screened it on 3 sides. And I believe they didn't say specifically, at least not that I read, but they probably used a metal roof on top. And then they would place green peppers in that box, and they would condition the woodchucks to go in and eat the green peppers. Fair enough. And then what they would do is they would then take a bowl of repellent and put that bowl of repellent with the green material, and also do it with a control and see which one the woodchuck would spend most of its time in, both in terms of occupancy. They had sensors to tell them whether the woodchuck entered, but they also were looking at consumption of food. So that was the study. Fair enough. And they had enough replication. So they had, I think 9 different burrow sites were tested during 3 months, April, May, and June in 1995. And so that is what they studied there. And they were doing these studies during 3 concurrent 3-hour sessions between the hours of 7 a.m. and 11 and 2 p.m. and 7 p.m. And so they had the 2 ends of the apparatus. They called it the apparatus, a sort of box. And they were containing 30 grams of fresh green peppers. And then they would use strips of filter paper containing, how about this, 0.1 milliliter of odorant, that's the repellent, or distilled water were placed at the edges of the bowls. And here are the chemicals that they used. Geranium oil, D-pulegon, I don't know what that is, coyote urine, and N.J.A, as well as cinnamon leaf oil, pennyroyal oil, and Siberian pine needle oil. Those were the chemicals that they tested. So here's the results of their findings. Let me get to that particular page. So here we go. So here are the products that they found to be that they tested and what the results were. So here we have repellency values of pennyroyal, cinnamon, bobex, pine needle oil, D. Pulegon, geranium oil, deer away, and coyote urine. And as you can see down here, hope I could blow that up large enough for you there. For those of you watching online, I don't want you to have to strain your eyes here. But what you can see here is that the two most effective products were deer away and coyote urine. And their repellency values they have here is, plus standard error measures of 15 plus. Okay. Pennyroyal didn't do anything. Cinnamon barely did anything. Bobex did better, over 5. Pine needle oil did 5. D. Pulegon looks like it's almost to 10, as well as geranium oil. So basically 4 products had some effect, but limited, right? I mean, what we really want to see is that the animal just doesn't use it at all. So this confirms, at least as far as the coyote urine is concerned, does confirm other findings where coyote urine had been shown to show some repellency. Now, I want to be careful here. All of you should know that anytime we use a product to repel, that is considered a pesticidal use. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I don't want to get down into the law school area of things. I'm just telling you how the EPA defines a pesticide, and it's very broad. So if you're using coyote urine to lure a coyote, that is not a pesticide. If you use coyote urine to repel an animal, that's a pesticide. And so you can see how it's a legal distinction. It can be a little kooky at times, and it's annoying to be sure. But nevertheless, that's just how things are. And I know that a lot of people in wildlife control are using products that are not EPA labeled, and they're using them as repellents, and that's just the way it is. You need to work that out with your attorney and your conscience and how you understand your state regulations. Some states are a little bit more specific and technical than others, and they will explicitly state things, right? So you need to find that out. I'm not encouraging the use of repellents. I'm not a big fan, and I hope that's coming across here. I haven't found them to be worth the effort. For those of you, except in one area, I do want to say one thing, except in one area, that is, I do believe that repellents do have a role in sometimes causing animals to move their den sites. So certainly there's been plenty of evidence, at least anecdotally at least, where people have used, coyote urine to try to move a fox den from under a shed and that sort of thing. So that, let me caveat that. But typically when we're trying to stop feeding behavior, generally speaking, a lot of these repellents just don't work the way we would like them to work, even the ones that have shown to have efficacy, because again, our clients want 100% control. If you have clients that are like, I just want to see the damage reduced, that's a different story, and now you open up space for the repellency. And I understand this is very nuanced, and so I'm hoping you're bearing with me here, but if you have someone who's like, I don't want to use any lethal control, then repellents can maybe mitigate and reduce the damage. Repellents work better, though, when the animal has somewhere else to feed. What I tell people when we're talking about deer repellents, which are certainly the most researched products, that they work great when you use them and your neighbor doesn't, right? Because you want the deer to go over to the untreated plants. That's when they really work well. That's when you get some really staggering numbers, like 80% higher repellency, which is awesome. But for many situations, it's just not going to be practical. Now, all that being said, when you're using repellents, especially things like coyote urine, have they been sterilized? Because if you're getting, raw urine from, maybe you're getting the good stuff from a bait dealer or something, has it been sterilized? So are you putting more bacterial elements in an area? So you certainly want to be careful when you're using it around food sources. Obviously, an ornamental garden is different than a food garden. Think carefully about what you're doing. Fencing is certainly going to be important, but The research here shows that coyote urine is really good, and also a product called Deer Away is also very, very good. Geranium oil had some effect, and D-Pulegon, I'd have to look that up. I don't know what that is. And what an interesting thing is they did find is they were shocked that the pine needle oil did not work that well, and which confounded them, because pine needle oil contains chemicals that have been shown to have repellency against and herbivores. And what they found was, and I thought this was rather intriguing, what they found is that the woodchucks that lived near pine trees were not repelled by it. But when they excluded those woodchucks from their analysis of the data, they found that the woodchucks that didn't live under pine trees were more repelled by it. So there's an interesting element here about the notion of novelty, that sometimes smells have some repellency because they're new and an animal doesn't know what it is. And so that may be something that could be useful. In other words, we may need to think about repellents as something that, not something that we would use on the same animal all the time, but maybe for limited, short periods of time when we need an animal to stop doing this now, and we only need a few days. Like when I talk about birds, for instance, when we do, frightening devices are used, I often tell people, these frightening devices often have value over short periods of time. Let's say maybe you're having a wedding at a particular location and you don't want birds roosting in the trees. Well, sometimes the frightening devices will have a short-term effect, so you can have your wedding and then get out. Because if you use the frightening device for too long of a period, the animals habituate to it, or can habituate to it. Perhaps that is the same thing that can happen to repellency. As I recall, there was an article on mosquitoes once that talked about DEET, and that is DEET they found mosquitoes that would be repelled by DEET for a while, but then after a longer period of time, it was no longer repellency for the mosquitoes, even though the chemical levels, I guess, were relatively high. So it just shows you that animals are adapting to the conditions that we provide for them. So maybe we need to be thinking about repellents in a shorter term, a novelty idea, that we're scaring the animal with something new. Because in nature, new means is often a threat. So a novel odor can sometimes be a repellent. But obviously, certainly with pennyroyal, it wasn't. And cinnamon, pretty low. But when they got up into the pine needle oil, they found that it did work better when it was for the woodchucks that weren't previously exposed to pine trees. Then they had, of course, so the two takeaways here. Number one, the two repellents that had the most effect on woodchucks would be Deer Away and coyote urine. Of course, some coyote urines are registered with the EPA. Whether they include woodchucks on them, I don't know. And then Deer Away, I'm not aware that Deer Away is registered as a woodchuck repellent. It is registered as a deer repellent, and I think even rabbits is included. You have to check your label. But something to think about. Maybe those of you, if you have contact with some manufacturers, maybe there's a way to get some of these other animals listed, because this article is out there, and it's something for you to think about. It's because more of our clients are wanting these so-called non-lethal control methods, and you need to have this sort of background information to be sure you're giving them reliable resource information rather than just a knee-jerk reaction. Oh, none of that stuff works. Well, because if they do a little internet search, they're going to read things that may say it does work, and it does. It just may not work the way they want it to. So hopefully that's helpful for you. Well, that's the end of my presentation today. I told you I'd be short because I got to hit the road, get to the airport in order to get to this conference that I'm attending. Wildlife Across America is going to be held out in Wisconsin area. So thanks for tagging along. Do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, and would love to hear from you if you want to be on the show. Perhaps you have a topic you'd like to have covered. Certainly would love to hear from you. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. You can also join us on Facebook on the Pesky Podcast family there and join the revolution, as Frank calls it. We'd love to have you there. You can talk about your triumphs and your trials, and also as a place to ask questions. Would love to see you there. Well, you've been listening to Living the Wildlife as part of the Pesky Podcast family. And why do we call it Living the Wildlife? Because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everyone.